some of our perceived notions as far as how good the players starting in each spot are. And we're going to compare the Dolphins roster up against the rest of the 2022 NFL teams based on the play through the first 10 weeks of the 2022 season.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Dolphins fans? Kyle Krabs, Locked On Dolphins, your team every day here on the Locked On Network. We don't just say it, we live it. Appreciate you guys making Locked On Dolphins your first Miami Dolphins listen of the day. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, lifelong Miami Dolphins fan and co-founder of the draftnetwork.com, and excited to revisit something that we did in the summer or in the build up to the start of the regular season. And I thought this would be a good thing for us to do on the bye week. First of all, I wanted to give everybody a couple more days to get any power to the pod questions in this week. So we'll do that on Friday this week. Obviously, we don't have crossover Thursday tomorrow because the Dolphins are playing the bye week this weekend. So I don't think we have Locked On bye week. I think that's the one thing that we don't have. So getting instead a chance to kind of look across the Dolphins within themselves and their own little ecosystem, and then compare that ecosystem across the 32-team landscape from the roster power rankings project. And we did this over at Draft Network. September 1st, I think, is when it ran. But we put all the players on all the rosters across all 32 teams into a series of buckets. And then we held those, we accounted for positional value, we accounted for injuries, but pretty much the higher your bucket, the more points you scored. And then there was a positional value weight that carries everything out, and you add all up all the totals, and it gives you kind of this end ranking of 1 through 32, position adjusted. How good is your roster? How much talent have you acquired? And I think it's really important perspective for us as Dolphins fans to kind of look across, because we're so in the weeds with what's happening with the Dolphins on a weekly basis. Talking about, man, no Byron Jones. Kader Kohu's a baller, but is Xavier Howard, Kader Kohu, Keon Crossan, and Justin Bett, like, is that enough with Noah Benogany? Like, the corner room's problematic. But you look across the rest of the landscape, and what you realize very quickly is Xavier Howard is a big divide to have, even when he's been dealing with the groin injuries that he's been working with. You look over on the offensive side of the ball, and the first month of the season or so, there was a lot of discussions around the offensive line and the quality of the offensive line, and if Connor Williams was good enough. And you got Robert Hunt and Teron Armstead, but the swing tackle position, you could put it into perspective pretty quickly with this kind of project. And that's what I am looking forward to doing here on the show, is updating what our preconceived notions were, and talking about some of the significant changes that the Dolphins have had take place, and how it impacts their rank and their standing across the entire NFL in each of these positional categories. And then, of course, how the Dolphins roster stacks up to the rest of the NFL. So I say all that to kind of get us started with, you have to know where you're coming from, right? So I have the preseason rankings up as the first talking point, and the Dolphins ranked 7th in the NFL. And this doesn't account for coaching. It doesn't account for strength of schedule. Doesn't account for home and away. Doesn't account for travel. Doesn't count for any of that. It's just the players that are available and on your 53-man roster. How talented is your roster? The Dolphins were 7th. The Dolphins, with the update that we just did, that we're going to be running for the Draft Network this week, we're going to do the full 32-team power rankings. The Dolphins check in 4th. So they're up 3 spots. They're up to the 4th most talented roster adjusted for positional value in the entire NFL in accordance to our film study, right? And it's a subjective grade. And I kind of embrace and welcome the subjectivity, but it's cool when you see the subjectivity that you are trying to work your way through and apply, marry up and match the results on the field. So I'll do the top 10 from before the start of the season. We could talk about some of these teams and how their seasons have progressed. But I think it holds up fairly well before you account for injuries. The Buffalo Bills were ranked first in this exercise. The Cincinnati Bengals number 2, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers 3, the LA Chargers 4, the Green Bay Packers 5. That's your first kind of really ugly ones. Them sitting at 4 and 6. Of course, the Chargers and Bucks at 5 and 5, and the Bengals at 5 and 4. But all kind of dealing with varying degrees of injuries. The Kansas City Chiefs at 6. They're, of course, a half a game in front of the Dolphins for first place in the AFC Conference through 10 weeks. The Dolphins at 7. The Baltimore Ravens at 8. The Philadelphia Eagles at 9. And then the Minnesota Vikings at 10. So some good football teams tucked in here. The Packers are the only one with a losing record at this point in the season. But again, this doesn't count for strength of difficulty. And I look at the games that the Dolphins have lost, right? Well, they lost to the team that coming into the season, we had rated it as the number 2 most challenging game on the schedule. The Jets, obviously, the Jets game is the Jets game. And then they lost to the team that was ranked 10th, the Minnesota Vikings. So in the update, and we're going to get into the Dolphins roster here after we kind of set the stage on where the Dolphins team total fits, and then we'll go through each of the Dolphins positional units and how they stack. Dolphins are in 4th place. They sit behind the Buffalo Bills, the Philadelphia Eagles, the Kansas City Chiefs, and that is it. They are narrowly in front of the Minnesota Vikings and the Baltimore Ravens, and then the Chargers, Bucks, Bengals, kind of reflecting of their injuries that they have occurred and have been working with. And then the San Francisco 49ers sit at 10. And of course, they traded for Christian McCaffrey, so they had a big influx there. They've lost some players defensively, but they largely have all their cornerstone players. The Chargers, for example, they have Joey Bosa out for an extended period of time. That hurts their ranking. So this is kind of as we reflect on where the teams are, and that's where I get excited for the Dolphins. You get Byron Jones back, they'll probably, I tell you, they probably won't. They would jump the Chiefs. From a talent perspective, if you get Byron Jones back, I'm not going to sit here and say that Byron Jones is coming back. But the Dolphins increasing their team, their roster total by about a point is worth the 10th highest jump from the start of the season till mid-season. Like Green Bay, they lost 7.5 points. They went from a 25 to a 17. Pretty significant drop there. The Bengals and Bucks dealing with some significant injuries. The Bengals, Chidobe Awuzie out for the season. DJ Reader's missed time. So you kind of get a snapshot on, okay, here's how attrition has hit these teams. I think the Dolphins making the moves that they did and adding Jeff Wilson and adding Bradley Chubb at the trade deadline certainly put them in a position to say, hey, we're kind of treading water because we had some players who were improved or were incomplete evaluations that we didn't give a grade to. And that's the next stage of this conversation, that have declared themselves as good players, kind of offset the attrition and losses that you had in the secondary. Well, now those additions of Chubb and Wilson actually mean this Dolphins roster, despite the attrition that they have taken on, is improved relative to the rest of the NFL. Hope you guys are enjoying this conversation. But before we go any further, got to talk to you about our friends over at Turo, the world's largest car sharing marketplace. With Turo, you can book any car you want, wherever you want it, and from a community of local hosts. You browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget across the US, UK, Canada, and soon coming to Australia as well. You can book a spacious SUV or minivan for a family road trip, get a classic or luxury car for a special event or a holiday. You can find affordable economy cars if you're on a budget and just need to get from A to B. Many Turo hosts will even deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. Forget boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo.com. So let's talk about the Dolphins and specifically how things have changed for the Dolphins since the last time we did this exercise. Tua Tagovailoa was considered an adequate level starter in the offseason. Not anymore. I think if you put the quarterbacks based on performance, resume, sample size, physical attributes, Tua Tagovailoa, I have him down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th quarterback in the NFL right now. That's pretty significant jump from he was kind of in a crowd of guys that you could all give the same score to. He's earned that with his play on the field this season. And of course, yes, the sample size is small. Even just if you look at this season in its entirety relative to the rest of it, and we understand why the rest of his career resume to this point doesn't give you the warm and fuzzies. And we understand there were a lot of extenuating circumstances that fed into that. But Tua Tagovailoa right now, across the entire NFL, ranking as a top 8 quarterback. And that's reflected, and that's a large part of the boost that the Dolphins receive is the emergence of Tua. Because I remember in the summertime when we looked at the Dolphins roster, I said, if you omit the quarterback position itself and you look at supporting cast, defense and offensive speaking, the Dolphins were top 3 in the NFL. Well, now you have a top 8 quarterback to go with that strong supporting cast that has gotten reinforcements on both sides of the ball. And that's how the Dolphins end up getting spit out in the grand scheme of things as a top 4 talent roster from a roster power rankings perspective. We do have the Dolphins sitting at 5th from a skill players perspective. The 49ers coming in first place with Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk as their wide receivers, George Kittle and Kyle Juszczyk as their tight end types, and the addition of an elite back and Christian McCaffrey puts them in a position to take the top spot. The Vikings checking in at 2. They have one of the best receivers in the NFL in Justin Jefferson. They have a couple adequate starters in Adam Thielen and KJ Osborne behind him, but they went out the trade deadline and got a quality starter in TJ Hawkinson at the tight end position, and then another elite back in Dalvin Cook. That's what I'll say for the Dolphins. They've got good depth, and they've got scheme-specific type talents that are highly effective. When we saw this for the first time against the Browns with Jeff Wilson and Raheem Mostert. The Dolphins are the only team to have 2 elite franchise cornerstone players at the wide receiver position in the entire NFL. So if you're looking just at wide receivers, the Dolphins wide receiver core is the best in the NFL in this exercise. If you missed the initial discussion in the summertime, would like to set the table for you guys with how we break down the players. You have elite franchise cornerstones, quality starters, adequate starters, incomplete evaluations, rookies, quality depth, replacement level players, non-roster caliber players, and developmental practice squad type players. But we are far enough into the season, for example, that Kader Kohou, he's a rookie. And when we did this in the summer, well, rookies, we don't have any definitive things to say, no statements, no film to base anything on. So you get a net 0, right? It's not positive. It's not negative. It's an incomplete portion. And incomplete evaluations also were a net 0. So that was every team. The more of those players you had, the more upward and downward mobility you had based on the way that the season had went. So Kader Kohou as a rookie was scored a net 0, but he's scoring as the floor is a minimum start, is an adequate starter. I think if you project him long-term in the slot, I think he could be a quality starter in the slot. But just using him as an example, and the Dolphins didn't have a ton of incomplete evaluations. Jalen Phillips was somebody who you could make a strong case for being an incomplete evaluation. But just to be clear, the players that I did score for the Dolphins as elite roster cornerstones. Tyreek Hill, no surprise. Jalen Waddle has earned that distinction. Xavier Howard. Bradley Chubb, acquired at the trade deadline. Javon Holland. Christian Wilkins. Teron Armstead. That is a total of 1, 2, 3. I'm not a math guy. Hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7. That is tied for the most of any roster in the NFL. So the weight those players carry as far as significant individual needle movers, and I've already said Tua Tagovailoa is a quality star. And if he plays the rest of the year the way that he is playing right now, when we update this at the end of the regular season, Tua is going to have a chance to be an elite roster cornerstone as well. But I'd always rather be like incrementally too slow instead of having overly dramatic swings of the pendulum back and forth. And, he played really well last 2 months. He didn't finish quite so strong, so I got to scale him back down. And so that level and progression is there at that position. But with the 7 roster cornerstones that the Dolphins have, they are tied for most in the NFL. And as I said, from a wide receiver perspective, because they have 2 elite cornerstone players, they're comfortably the best in the NFL. Now, offensive line, I think, is interesting. If Teron Armstead graded as a elite roster cornerstone, Liam Eichenberg, if he's in there, and he's not right now because he's on IR, I moved him out of incomplete evaluation and graded him as a replacement level player. But Robert Jones, I think, his floor is a quality depth piece. I think he can continue to grow. We'll see if he gets that opportunity. So I have elite roster cornerstone, quality depth at left guard. Connor Williams and Robert Hunt are both quality starters. So the second tier, just below roster cornerstones. Braden Shell is an adequate starter. Your swing tackle, of course, is Greg Little. I graded him as a replacement level player as well. This Dolphins offensive line, according to this exercise and this approach with subjectivity for film, it ranks as the 9th in the NFL. 9th rated offensive line. And to compare that, to give you guys some context, we'll use the Raiders as an example because they're a team that really struggles up front. They have an adequate starter at left tackle. They have a replacement level player at left guard. They have 2 quality depth players serving as starters, and they have a rookie on their offensive line. They do not have a single quality starter on the offensive line. The Bengals, Jonah Williams is a replacement level player. Cordell Volson, left guard, is a rookie. And then you have Ted Karras, Alex Kappa, and Lyle Collins, who all graded as adequate level starters. They also do not have a single quality starter on their offensive line. The LA Rams, one of the worst offensive lines in football right now. They do have 2 quality starters, but they pair that with 2 practice squad caliber players and a replacement level player. So you have 2 quality starters, a replacement level player, and 2 practice squad caliber talents on your offensive line. Miami, you've got 3 quality starters plus and 4 adequate starters plus. Dolphins' offensive line, from a talent perspective, looks to be in pretty good shape right now. And that's reinforced with the way that they're playing. Just for context, I thought you guys would appreciate to know one of the teams that two of the teams that we've played in the last 3 weeks actually sit in the top 8, aka above the Dolphins for offensive lines. The Browns with Wills, Bitonio, Posich, Wyatt Teller, and Jack Conklin. Those are all the floor's adequate starters. You got 3 adequate starters on that offensive line. An elite player in Wyatt Teller who was banged up and was kind of in and out of the game against the Dolphins, and then Joel Bitonio is a quality starter. And then the Detroit Lions. Penei Sewell is a roster cornerstone. Taylor Decker and Frank Ragnow is quality starters. Jonah Jackson is an adequate starter. They kind of have a musical chairs thing going on at right guard. But I thought you guys, the context of the Dolphins' offensive line ranks top 10 in the NFL, according to this exercise. And that's an adjustment. They were in the mid-teens, closer to 20 when we did this in the summertime. But based off a 10-game sample size, rewatching the film and readjusting how you're scoring the players, it's a top 10 graded offensive line, strictly speaking from a talent perspective. The skill group in its entirety, fullbacks, running backs, tight ends, wide receivers, top 5 in the NFL. Tua Tagovailoa rated as the 7th quarterback in the NFL. It's a good offense. It's the reason why this team with Tua Tagovailoa at the helm is averaging about 30 points a game. There's some good, interesting storylines on the defensive side of the ball as well that I certainly think are worth our time that we'll dive into next, but not before. Let everybody know about our friends over at LinkedIn and what they can do for you. These days, every potential new hire feels like a high-stakes wager on your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. You can have the purple hashtag hiring framed to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you are hiring. And simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on the candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you would like to interview and hire. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. Bet Online is your number one stop for anything and everything sports gambling. Get all the latest odds, trends, info, stats, news, analysis for every professional and amateur league out there, from football to basketball, soccer to esports. We got it all over at Bet Online. If you love sports podcasts, you can find those over at Bet Online as well. Fastest and easiest way to get your betting fix. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. Bet Online, where the game starts. Defensively, the Dolphins do take a little bit of a hit because Emmanuel Ogbah placed on IR, although Ogbah was graded as a adequate level starter. He came into the season as a quality starter, so he actually was downgraded based on the performance, and I understand he played through some injuries. But the good news is I thought a player who was an incomplete evaluation in my mind was Andrew Van Ginkel, just because he had always been so highly rotational with his availability. So you got Andrew Van Ginkel, who was an upgrade to an adequate starter. You got Melvin Ingram, who at this stage in his career is an adequate starter. I think you have Jalen Phillips as a quality starter and more upward mobility waiting for him. And then Bradley Chubb, who's a roster cornerstone because he's a more established player. Inside on the defensive line, Christian Wilkins is a roster cornerstone. Zach Sealer, I would grade as a quality starter. And then your third interior defensive lineman is Raekwon Davis. I think he's an adequate starting nose tackle in the NFL. The Dolphins have the best graded defensive line in the NFL in this project. Number one. They're just in front of the Philadelphia Eagles, which have an embarrassment of riches with Robert Quinn, Hassan Reddick, Josh Sweat, all quality starters at defensive end. Javon Hargrave, rookie Jordan Davis, who's playing impactful football for them. Obviously, he's a little banged up. He's missing a little bit of time right now. And then Fletcher Cox and Milton Williams are their third and fourth interior defensive linemen. That is an extremely impressive group. The Dolphins can go toe-to-toe with anybody up front. And I understand the question is, what about the sacks? Again, there's a lot that goes into sacks and pressures. The Dolphins sacked Jacoby Brissett 3 times yesterday, and they were all over him. For an example, just want to back this up. One of the things that I've been charting since this became a discussion point in the narrative is I'm looking across the entire NFL. And I'm looking at opposing quarterbacks that the Dolphins have on the schedule. And I want to know across their entire season what their time to throw and what their depth of target is on the year. And then I want to know what those numbers, time to throw from snap to release of the ball on average across all attempts, and depth of target, how many yards down the field your average target is across all of your attempts in a game. I want to know what it is against the Dolphins. And I don't know what the difference is. And I'll tell you this. Quarterbacks facing the Dolphins through 10 weeks. Mac Jones, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Zach Wilson, Kirk Cousins, Kenny Pickett, Jared Goff, Justin Fields, Jacoby Brissett. Their average time, their cumulative, all of those quarterbacks on all of the attempts that they have made this season, on average, is 2.85 seconds in every game that they have played. But in the individual games in which they are playing the Dolphins, their average snap to release is 2.66 seconds, aka 20% or 2/10 of a second faster they're throwing the ball against the Dolphins than their complete season average. Think about that. 2.66 seconds versus 2.85. Their average depth of target is marginally shorter. It's about 1/10 of a yard, so there's not any significant difference. But what's really fun for me is to be able to put this up here and compare and contrast the weeks in which the Dolphins force a quarterback to hold the ball equal to or longer than they usually do versus the quarterbacks who get out and throw the ball abnormally quicker than what they do when they're playing the Dolphins. The Dolphins' 3 best statistical performances from a sacks and an attempts with pressure perspective on the season were the 3 games in which the Dolphins had the time to throw most closely reflected or longer than the season average for that player. Josh Allen held the ball for 2.87 seconds in week 3 versus an average time to throw on the year of 2.79. So it was almost 1/10 of a second longer. And his average depth of target against the Dolphins was only 5.7 yards. So holding it for almost 3 seconds to average less than 6 yards downfield per target across 60-something targets. 63 targets. The Dolphins logged 46 pressures on 63 attempts. Josh Allen was 8 of 17 beyond 10 yards down the field. The Dolphins sacked him 4 times, and they pressured him on 73% of his dropbacks. Dolphins won the football game. Kenny Pickett, 2.72 versus 2.77. Average depth of target of 6.9 yards. The Dolphins cooked him up. They had 3 interceptions on targets 10-plus yards downfield. And Kenny Pickett was 4 of 12 on passing attempts further than 10 yards down the field, air yards down the field. And Jacoby Brissett, you ready for this number? 80%. 35 pass attempts, 28 pressures. 4 out of every 5 dropbacks, the Dolphins were in Jacoby Brissett's lap. They forced him to hold the ball for 2.88 seconds versus 2.91 on the season. Sacked him 3 times. There is a correlation with structurally how you play, what kind of access you give, and I do not think it is a coincidence that the Dolphins played a lot of man coverage against Jacoby Brissett. Now, they played man against the Bears too because they trusted their guys could blanket and cover the receivers. Well, they did, and then Justin Fields just happens to be a 4.4 athlete that ran for 178 yards. Because Justin Fields on average held the ball for 2.37 seconds versus a season average that was over 6. He got the ball out 7/10 of a second faster against the Dolphins than his season average. Think about that. So it was either quick or he was running. So I did not mean to go down that rabbit hole in the midst of this podcast, but I think it's important when you hear me say the Dolphins have the most talented defensive line in the NFL. It's from a quality of talent, and it's also from a depth perspective. And all of these questions that exist with the pass rush. I think it's worth acknowledging the opponents facing the Dolphins through 10 games are 44 of 105 on air yards attempts that go further than 10 yards or further down the field. They're completing 42% of pass attempts that travel further than 10 yards in the air against the Dolphins. But inside of 10 yards, they are completing 79% of their pass attempts. You tell me. It's not a coincidence, but it's the life the Dolphins have chose to live because they've incurred injuries on the back end of the defense. You have to play more conservative. You have to let things be in front of you, and then the onus is on you to come up and tackle. Anyway, linebackers. The Dolphins in the middle of the pack. They're sitting 14th. Jerome Baker, Elena Roberts, Duke Riley, Sam McGlavin. The big upgrade was Duke Riley. I have him graded as an adequate level starter where he was quality depth before the season starts. So that moves the needle for the Dolphins a little bit. They check in 14th, so they're a middle of the pack linebacker core. I can really sit here and envy the San Francisco 49ers and the Buffalo Bills and the New Orleans Saints and some really talented linebacker groups. The 49ers, Fred Warner, roster cornerstone, elite player. Dre Greenlaw is a quality starter. Oren Burks is an adequate starter. The Bills have a 1-2 punch of Edmonds and Milano that are cornerstone type players. I think this is an area that we will continue to revisit, especially as the Dolphins, if they embrace and adapt this style of playing defense. More dynamic players, and we'll see what Channing Tindall gives us down the stretch. But that's a part of the roster that I kind of have my eye on, and I'm interested to see how it develops. And then you have the secondary. The secondary ranks 24th out of 32 teams in the NFL right now. They've lost a lot of bodies. They have. Xavier Howard, Keon Crossan, Kader Kohu, graded at the time being as your top three corners. Kohu preferably plays inside, but I think he can play outside. I think he's shown that the last couple of weeks. Howard's a elite roster cornerstone. Crossan is a quality depth player, and Kohu's a rookie who graded out as an adequate starter. Javon Holland, roster cornerstone. Eric Rowe, an adequate level starter, although we'll say the last 2 or 3 weeks he has played his rear end off. Last 2 weeks. He's played his rear end off. He's played really, really well the last couple of weeks for the Dolphins. That's one that, if he can kind of get back to form and proves he's back to form, that might give you some reinforcements. That could probably, I'm just looking at the numbers now, would add X number of points. I won't say it out loud. Don't want to let you guys know how the sauce is made. It could push him around 18, 19 versus 24 right now. So it could get you closer to the midpoint of the NFL as far as the spectrum. But this group's propped up by two cornerstones in Xavier Howard and Javon Holland right now. You got guys that are playing fairly well, especially versus what their expectations were. But Byron Jones is a quality starter who's on the PUP. You don't get any points for him because he's played all year. And Brandon Jones is on IR, so you don't get any points for him, even though he's a quality starter within his respective role in the defense as well. So you lost two quality starters, plus the other guys that the Dolphins have lost. Mackenzie Alexander would be quality depth. Of course, he's out of the picture now for the Dolphins, and Trill Williams would have been an incomplete evaluation. But you fill those guys in up top here, and all of a sudden this is a top 10 group. But it's not, because this is where they've been hit with the injuries. By the way, the Browns, check-in number 2, Denzel Ward, roster cornerstone. Martin Emerson is a rookie, played well. Greg Newsome, a really good nickel corner, plays inside. John Johnson's a quality starter. Grant Delpit's an adequate starter. So Tua just dropped what he dropped on a team that is in the top 3 in the NFL in secondaries. So I hope this kind of paints a picture for you guys as far as where the Dolphins are at across the league in all of these positional groups. The Dolphins are bottom 8 in special teams right now. And that's really looking at 3 guys. Morstead's a quality starter. Jason Sanders is an adequate starter. He was a quality starter before the season started. Blake Ferguson's fine, and I haven't really designated anybody in the return role for the Dolphins just because it's been a revolving door. But this Dolphins team, man, the secondary has been the area from a talent perspective and an attrition perspective that they've taken some hits, and I think the way that they chose to strategize and mitigate try to mitigate those losses by investing in other areas where they haven't committed so much money for the next couple of years. And we'll see what kind of long-term flexibility the Dolphins can cook up after the season. But right now we got a season in front of us where you're 7-3. You got the Texans coming out of the bye at home before you have the 3-game road trip. You get the Chargers, who rank in the top 10 at the midpoint of this project from a talent perspective. Again, this does not account for coaching or injury. It does account for injuries, but not like, oh, he's questionable and then he doesn't play on Sunday. It doesn't account for that kind of injury, but transactional moves that take you off the roster, it does account for. Doesn't account for bye weeks or rest or team culture and chemistry. It doesn't account for any of that. It's just how good is your roster. Dolphins are sitting 4th right now. Pretty well-rounded. Got a lot of players playing at a high level. But after the Texans, you got 3 teams that also sit in the top 10. The Bills, the Chargers, and the 49ers. Softens up a little bit after that. The Packers fell to 14th. The Patriots are 18th. And the Jets are 21st. Texans come in at 30th. So the test for Miami will be how they do the rest of the way, of course. Your race is to 10 wins. You get 10 wins, you feel like you're going to punch your ticket to the postseason no matter what. And if you don't, especially this year, then I don't know. But the Dolphins have positioned themselves very well from a wins-losses perspective, from a roster maneuverability perspective. A lot of the waiver wire maneuvers, the addition of a guy like Brandon Shell is clutch for this football team. He's playing like an adequate starter right now. And the Dolphins are reaping the benefits as they're one of the teams. There were only, from the start of the season till now, there were only 9 teams whose score was better than when the season started. Only 9. Less than a third of the league. And the Dolphins are amidst that group despite the injuries that they've pulled in the secondary. Why not the Dolphins? Why not? I'll let you be the judge. Hope you guys enjoyed this exercise. We got 2 more shows this week. We're doing Power to the Pod on Friday. Make sure you guys get your questions in for the bye week. I'll keep an eye out for them. I've gotten plenty of them already. Looking forward to chatting with you guys again tomorrow. So fins up. Keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins.